Before I jump into that, I want to talk a little bit about kind of where I got my start and how that kind of evolved forward. So I taught myself how to design and program when I was 11 years old. I'm the middle child of a plumber and a school bus driver, and got my hands on my first Mac at a young age, and kind of harnessed that energy into building websites. And so where that started moving forward is I started an agency at 13 years old, broke into the music industry, and was working with Mick Jagger, Katy Perry, Lenny Kravitz, Slash before I could legally drink. And so that for me was kind of my first splash into building experiences. And where I went from there was an even sexier, more lucrative, and fast-paced sector. If you have any guesses, it's the museum sector. So I started working in the museum sector after finding my passion start to really expand into art and culture and visual kind of anthropology, and just saw that these places were the underpin for our culture, our society, yet the tools that were available in the sector were sorely behind. They were obsolete, they were clunky, they were expensive, and they didn't really meet the consumer expectations. And so, quoting someone, a name brand here in Silicon Valley, Mark Andreessen at Andreessen Horowitz, software is eating the world. And you think about, well, every sector, every industry, is being disrupted, including culture. And culture has a really incredible way of feeding the world. It enriches our soul. It's here to inspire us. So I started Cuseum in 2014, to solve those problems and to make it easier, affordable, more flexible, and more in line with consumer expectations all through their devices. And we've become the fastest growing company in the museum and cultural sector, working with some of the largest institutions, including SF MoMA here in the Bay. And so what's been really interesting to watch, especially with all of these new technologies, augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality, is all of these tech companies have been looking to museums as their sandbox. So you look at what Google's done, what Apple uses for use cases, you look at what IBM's done, and so on. Museums are these experience factories, so naturally they're inspiring all communities, including developers. And so kind of flipping the lens a little and talking more specifically about some of the projects we've had the great fortune of working on, I'll leave you similar to what the previous speaker was underscoring, that looking how culture and information and content has been consumed is one thing, but looking how these tools, when they're readily available and kind of pervasive, how those can change the way we create culture, not just display it and consume it, but how we create culture, how we produce it. So we had the opportunity to launch the first museum-funded, or the first instance of a AR exhibition in the world funded and produced by a museum with the Perez Art Museum down in Miami. This also happened to be the first instance of AR kit used in the museum space as well. So we worked with a Miami-based artist, Felice Grodin, to basically take what would have been ideas for sculpture and to bring them to life, and also produce them in a very iterative capacity. So this exhibition wasn't one and done. New works were introduced month over month as the artist would meet with visitors and get a sense of what their feedback was, what they liked, what they didn't like, the texture, the reaction, and has expanded to several works. This one's been featured all over the place. And then more recently, I'll tell you a little story. 28 years ago, on St. Patrick's Day, two men, dressed up like police officers, broke into the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, Massachusetts. They robbed the museum of 13 works, which in total value, $500 million worth of art, making it the world's largest art heist. So that's over at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. One day after experimenting with my product team in the area of the new capabilities of AR Kit 1.5, image recognition on device, vertical surface detection, one of my colleagues said, what would be really interesting is if we go and we put the stolen art back on the walls at the Gardner. So I said, okay, that's a novel idea. We'll see if it works. This was like 1 or 2 days after beta was released. And so we went over, and on a Thursday night, we started to experiment to see, is the image detection accurate enough? Is the spatial detection accurate enough? And is the lighting plentiful enough to make this thing happen? I can tell you after 10 minutes of waving the iPad around and seeing if it works, that we were stopped by a security guard. Just to remind you, this was the home to the world's largest art heist, who told us to put all of our stuff down. Hey, you kids, put your stuff down. What do you think you're doing? And I said, we're putting the stolen art back in the frames. He stopped me, and then I finished my sentence using augmented reality. He didn't find any of this humorous. He didn't know what augmented reality was. A supervisor came, asked what we're doing, and I explained we're using augmented reality, and she said, speak English to me. I don't understand what you're talking about with all this technical jargon. And I said, well, let me show you. Held the device up, put the works back in their frame, and I'll just jump to the chase that this has been featured in over 125 publications around the world, ranging from Wired to Fast Company to Vice and National Geographic. I don't know if there's any relationship, but it's been written about at least 20 times in Russia. So if we're looking for leads, talk to the FBI. But that was really interesting to say, let's look at how culture has been taken from the public eye. Let's respect culture and highlight just how precious these artifacts in this culture is. And so it created all sorts of debates. The Museum Association of Africa said, well, look at all of our artifacts that have been stolen over the years. Wouldn't it be great? It'd be great to get those back in reality, but in the meantime, to create a virtual or augmented version of these works for people to take a look at. So it was really incredible to think of the impact that literally this nights and weekends rush thrown together. People are out in the office drinking 2 days before St. Patrick's Day, and I realized, holy shit, St. Patrick's Day is 2 days away. If we need to, make this thing happen, it has to be on the anniversary. So we did that, and people were excited to talk about it, and also people started to examine the idea of who owns the digital space, who owns the augmented space. So it was interesting that it led to some conversations legally, ethically, and so on within the broader media landscape. So that was just something we were hacking around with that was really, that captured a lot of attention. And then one thing that really stuck with me, and this was really, around the Pokemon Go era, when consumer, interest just started to erupt, was something that Malik, debatably one of the fathers of the American internet blog and a VC here in the Bay Area, wrote a piece in the New Yorker, and he said, I wanted to know everything about the art. I feel as if I should be able to lift my phone and get more details rather than have to type a search term into my browser. He was describing the huge opening at SF MoMA, and the big takeaway for us and for him there was Pokemon Go had changed my expectations around how to access information. And it wasn't Pokemon Go, but it was the shift in expectation, perhaps, that was the game's true importance. So that really planted a seed in our mind around, it doesn't matter, what an institution or what a company feels is the one way, the one true way to do something. It's really led by the consumer. And if the consumer's expectations continue to increase, you have to continue to increase alongside those. And I mean, walking through the Expo hall here, it's very clear that there's some incredible things going on here, and the consumers are eating it up. They love it. They want more of it. So that idea, tied to the cultural space, there's a lot of, things to ask yourself. And the cultural institutions, the museum sector, public attractions are all having these conversations today. And so, again, right after ARKit 1.5 came out, we always jump into the museum. The museum is our sandbox, and we said, wouldn't it be amazing to play off of what Malik, wrote about that idea of just lifting up my phone? Honestly, why do people still think QR codes have, the right to exist in this day and age for accessing content? Why do people continue to punch in stop numbers? There are certainly some challenges to using Bluetooth beacons, although those are great for certain experiences. And so we took it out into the field, and were mesmerized. And people, similar to the Isabella Stewart Gardner example, people of every age group would come up to us. Older patrons, their mind was blown that a device could understand what it was looking at and kind of hold that. So you walk up to any of these pieces, it just magically appears. And then that's just like, this is honestly the basics. So like where things are going from here are wayfinding. Where things are going from here is challenging something that's existed for over a century, the idea of an object label to tell me about this work of art. Well, if you look at how people's preferences for consuming information, the context, the accessibility implications, the languages we speak. If I walk into your museum and your museum's mandate is to serve the public, the broader public, and be accessible for us, the object label should be obsolete. We should kill the object label and let it live in my language, in my length, in my, all of the elements around my preferences taken into consideration. So we've launched this with a number of institutions, and it's been really incredible to see what the reaction is when someone who travels halfway around the world to go to a museum, or even a museum in their community and feels included, that they don't need to read the English object label. They walk up and there's something in Spanish for them, or it's made audible, and it's just simple. I think there's the simplicity there. So we think a lot about these things and what their implications are, and wrote a piece in VentureBeat recently, exploring the idea that if the world was a book, then augmented reality is the digital magnifying glass. So it's giving us this truly new lens to learn about the things that are around us, to dive deeper and to add new experimental elements. And that's something that I'm really quite passionate about. So this new lens is something that we're building and rolling out. We work with about 175 cultural institutions around the United States. And so next time you're at a museum, keep your eyes open. You might have similar experiences to some of the things that I've put out here. So that's really all I have to say today, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of the work we're doing at Cuseum. If you're interested in checking out any of our experiments, check out Cuseum.com, send me an email. I have 7 minutes because I'm a fast talker from Boston, so I have 7 minutes to answer questions, and thank you so much.
So any questions on Slido? Okay, well, questions from the audience. And we'll start right here with this lady.
I have a question. Does your system work only on phones and pads, or you support any augmented reality glasses or smart glasses as well?
So right now we're focusing on things we consider to be mass consumer products, so the smartphone in our pockets, but we are exploring head-mounted opportunities, like some of the more visual-based ones, as well as Bose augmented audio is something that we're quite excited about, because you look at the legacy of this idea, that was introduced in the 1960s, that, how do you scale or duplicate your curator, your artist, your best tour guide? Well, you use an audio player. And so in the 60s, that was introduced, and then that evolved into these punch pad devices that you've seen, Acoustiguide and antenna audio, those traditional audio guides, and where things have should be and are is around mobile. So when it comes to the idea of shifting that idea, we're really focusing on the mobile device, but are eager and have been experimenting with head-mounted displays. Thank you.
Question. Thank you very much for your response. I'm over here if you want to see me.
Oh.
So you told that amusing, fascinating story about going to the Isabella Gardner Museum and almost getting arrested because the people didn't understand what the technology was that you were using. Have you found, since you've worked with so many cultural institutions, have you found that the curators in museums in general are sympathetic to this kind of thing, or are they suspicious of introductions of technology that they claim might get between the viewer and the experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, if you look across the museum staff, there's a wide variety of opinions when it comes to anything that mediates the experience, anything that stands in the way physically between the art on the walls and the visitor. But that's really started to get flipped on its head over the last couple of years with just the fact everybody is taking selfies, everybody is using social media. Museums have changed their photo and video policies. And so curators and directors are now starting to see, well, we don't only serve ourselves, we don't only serve academics, we serve the public. And so with that being acknowledged, more and more curators are excited about digital opportunities. With the Perez Art Museum in Miami, I'd never really heard such a response from that team in that, yeah, when you're talking about technology, often you have the curators, maybe writing it off too easily or being uncomfortable about this new medium that's being introduced. And so with the Pam AR with Felice Grodin, the piece that I showed earlier, what was amazing to hear was it was something that actually united all of the staff departments. And so the curator was incredibly excited about being able to, in the eyes of her colleagues and in her peers, to pioneer by working with an artist, not to produce a new sculpture that would be on the plaza or to produce works or that would be displayed in the white walls, but to actually work in a somewhat, I guess you could say, unproven new medium on a new framework. So like this was all happening as ARKit was introduced, and we're like, hey, let's go, let's give this a try. So there were definitely a lot of learnings that came through it, but now we honestly, it's been amazing. We have a museum that talks about rapid development, agile kind of project processes, and so it really instilled some of these mindsets in the museum that curators are bringing to the table. So yeah, it's an ongoing conversation. You might have seen in Time magazine a month ago or 2 months ago talking about the De Young in San Francisco and having like mobile phone free hours because some of the older guard or the older patrons felt that it was detracting from their experience. So it's like, it's definitely a tug of war, but the, all of the energy is around the answer being, it's whatever the consumer wants, it's whatever the visitor wants. We need to accommodate them, not our ideas of what is perfect or what is tradition.
And then as last question, if I could just ask Brennan, if you could tackle some of those on Slido, since we're trying to promote people to use that.
Cool. Yeah, any plans to take something like this outside of the traditional museum setting? So our company is very focused on the public attractions vertical. So that includes museums, aquariums, zoos, historical sites, landmarks, as well as arts organizations. So when looking at the overlays, we are looking at broader wayfinding and cultural exploration. So if you look at that and how it plays into travel, the use cases are pretty obvious. So those are things that we're exploring, but there always is some sort of cultural focus to it. We do get a lot of inquiries from retailers just because there's a lot of very clear use cases in a commercial capacity, but culture and museums is our focus.